Hello, everybody. My name is Roberto Pasqualino. I'm a visiting researcher at the Global Sustainability Institute at Anglia Ruskin University, and today I'm going to give an introduction on what is system dynamics. What we learn in this lecture is a definition of complex systems, what is a system thinking, that are kind of the fundamentals to understand what is system dynamics. Then we provide a definition of system dynamics. We give the fundamentals of the method, including stock and flows, and the nonlinear relationship, and then we show how this can be used to approach both ecological limits and decision making. All of it somehow forms the basis for modeling risk in system dynamics modeling and prepare for the next lecture to address global emerging risks altogether. So complex systems can be defined as sets of mutually dependent elements which interact one to another toward one or more purposes. If you have two elements A and B, the complex system is simply the fact that one can impact on the other and vice versa. As a result, it is not possible to control one to control the system, but we have to look at them together to find a way to improve the system over time. Example of a complex system can be, for example, a conversation between two people. Of course, that again, an element so an interaction between two people that should balance each other a little bit. We can think about the political decision making going towards more connection in a lot of people. We can move towards the entire planet, such as global ecosystems, and think about a lot of variety that could happen there, as well as think about the brain, which can be considered one of the most complex things known to human beings today. If you understand the complex system, you will find out that most of the things that surround us are complex systems. You can recognize them in the literature when you find terms such as feedback loop. So for example, chicken and the egg. What starts first is actually a dilemma. The important thing there is that one can cause the other and vice versa. We can look at terms like nonlinearity. You can think, for example, as a hurricane hitting the east coast of the United States of America, creating a lot of damage. Insurance sector seeing that nonlinearity very badly, and it is quite good to see at this picture because it shows a feedback loop inside as well. We can think about a path dependency. Of course, in complex systems, when one picks one particular path, is going to be very hard to reverse it and go back to the origin to take another one. For example, if you think about the oil industry, while investing a lot on that and creating very low cost to produce energy in that particular way, it creates barriers for the renewable energy to take over the market because the cost is very high in comparison. We can think about emergency phenomena such as the pandemic, which from very few infected people can grow to an entire population of the world potentially, and grow and collapse many times over the future. We can think about self-organization. We can think about these birds moving together, or we can think about even people grouping among each other and clustering somehow. We can think about the hierarchy that, of course, is normally used by people to manage this sort of complexity, if not really be necessary. As a result, when we approach things that are complex, the kind of thinking that is required is called system thinking, or holistic, or organismic, or ecological. System thinking gives emphasis to the whole, and according to such a view, the essential property of the ecosystem emerge from the interaction between the parts. As a result, the whole is gonna be always different from the mere sum of the parts. We can think on the sides, on the Causal loop diagram on the agricultural sector, which of course something is complex, and it's quite interesting in my view to see that as a third eye in the front of the head, simply because it gives a different view on looking at simply everything that's around us. Moving from system thinking to system dynamics, we have to give a bit of overview on the history of how system dynamics came through. And of course, the creator of system dynamics was Professor Forster, who passed away a few years ago. Used to be an electrical engineer with a lot of expertise in engineering of control and servo mechanics that he maturated during the Second World War. And of the 1950s, thanks to a career as well in management, they understood that this sort of thinking could be applied to manage industries, in particular the complexity around inventories, workforce interaction, and corporate design in general. As a result, in the 50s, he started formalizing the concept, and in the 61, he writes the first book, Industrial Dynamics, highlighting the principles of the method. However, in 69 and 71, he gets commissions for modeling, for applying the method to the city of Boston to manage their urban dynamics. That's another publication that came out from Forster. And in 1971, to apply the concept to the entire planet, to look at environmental problems, such as the limits of growth. As a result, he understood that this approach could go far beyond what was industrial dynamics, and decided to rename it system dynamics in the name of the approach to social sciences. Limits to Growth, from Meadows 1972, is the first publication referring to this method as system dynamics. So if we want to give a practical definition of system dynamics, it is a computer modeling approach to complex systems. The base of it is system thinking, that's just what we saw in the previous slides, and the computer modeling applied is focused on three main elements, which are feedback loops, accumulation processes, that we can refer to as stock and flows, and nonlinearities. At the end of the day, all of it requires computer simulation to test the structure formulated. So the purpose is always best practice to be the main determinant for the content of one particular model. The models normally focus on one particular problem that is a sort of dynamic, is expected to be a kind of a dynamic problem that is shown up by some historical data, and we want to solve. The result of it is that we can start framing some system boundaries around this problem, and so differentiating between what is the endogenous structure which can impact that system and what is exogenous, which basically is the part of the system that I cannot explain but still will impact my particular dynamic problem. We can move from that particular initial perspective towards the definition of elements and the definition of what is a causal loop diagram, one of the major elements and tools for system thinking. In this loop diagram, we can think about both tangible and not tangible elements, where you can think, for example, about forest land or resources or industry. On the other hand, we can think about perception delays or things that are not as tangible as physical things. After elements are defined, we can look at the interaction between them, connect them together, and define the polarity of their relationship, where a positive relationship indicates that one element can increase the second one, so that they basically increase together. An increase in one element defines an increase in another element, and the negative effect, which is normally indicated with a minus sign, is that an increase in one element generates a decrease in something else that is connected to it. As a result, thanks to the polarity and closed paths into the system, we can start defining and look for the feedback loops. Now, if the feedback loop are sum of a lot of positive dependencies, that will become a reinforcing loop. And instead, if we have some negative effects in the loop, they are balancing. In particular, the general rule is that if the number of negative relationships into one particular loop that is negative is odd, then that system, this feedback loop, will be a balancing loop, which basically means that an increase in one particular element will define automatically through the rest of the system a decrease in itself. So it will balance out. Now, when we look at the system from the top, we have also to cite Professor Richardson, 1991, that was saying that the view that system analysis to look at system is not close enough to look at system as discrete decision or a discrete processes, but is neither farther enough to look at, be ignorant about the process inside of it. As a result, is in the middle ground, which allows to approximate things like continuous time processes and allows to have an overview on systems. So, stressing the concept of a feedback loop, we find a man intricated into his problems of work or life. He decided to do something about that. He wanted to move, get some space. He didn't understand, unfortunately, that some feedback is going to come back on his hand. And this is exactly the way in which feedback loop act into our normal life, most often having counterintuitive consequences and sometimes being negative on us. Of course, this is a balancing feedback loop. After we understand the loops, we can define the accumulation processes and the stock and flows into the system. And this will be will allow to put that thing into the computer in practice, define the equations, and define the nonlinear relationship that impact it. As a result, is it possible to start testing and find solution to that particular dynamic problem to start? Now, a very simple example of system dynamics modeling is the bathtub. So you can think about a bathtub in which the flow will come in to the point which overflows when it's full. We can build a very simple model in which we have an inflow of water going inside the bathtub. And over a certain time, it will accumulate until the point it will reach the maximum capacity and it will start overflowing. If you think about that in practical equation, we can see that the water in the bathtub is an integral between what comes in minus what goes out. And what goes out is the max between 0 and what there is in the bathtub minus the maximum capacity, which basically means that that quantity must overflow. The result of it will be an accumulation when it's a straight line because it's a constant addition to the of water in the bathtub, and after reaching the capacity, it will stay there because it will simply go away. Now, in practice, many people will tell you that system dynamics is about stock and flows, but they are wrong in the sense that system stock and flows are generally the basic ABC for every single dynamic model. You can find that in other methodologies such as agent-based modeling or econometric or general equilibrium modeling or anything like you can think of. The important element which differentiates this approach to the others is what are the use of nonlinear relationship that are normally used to quantify feedback loops into the system dynamics model. And now we see how we use them. So let's start from a very simple structure. We are looking at the resource extraction problem, similarly as in the limits to growth. The objective of this, let's say, this little model made of very few elements is to employ the nonlinear relationship called impact of available resources on extraction to determine the actual resource extraction. So the system is very simple. The resources is a stock of finite material or anything, and this can be extracted. Of course, the more we extract them, the more the resources, the stock will decrease. The initial value for the resources is on the left side, so we call it 10,000 R as a unit of measurement for resources. And we pick a fraction of resources remaining as the ratio between resources that are decreasing and the constant initial resources. That fraction becomes the input to the nonlinear relationship. So it is going to come in from the x-axis. Of course, it will be as maximum level at the beginning of the simulation, it will be exactly 1, since resources equal the initial resources. and over time will decrease. This will imply the the fraction to go towards zero, bringing together non-linearly the resource extraction towards zero. Now, the way the nonlinear relationship work in system dynamics modeling is always the same, no matter the kind of focus we have, and it works as a multiplier towards something else. So in this particular case, the desired extraction is kept again as a constant. We want 100 resources per year to go away from the stock resources, but the more we reduce the stock of resources, the less will be possible to extract. Of course, in this particular case, the nonlinear relationship will work as a multiplier effect, which basically means it will allow the desired extraction to be at the maximum rate just at the beginning of the simulation, and after resources will start decreasing, it will quickly bring it back towards zero. And when, of course, the desired extraction, when the resource is completely depleted, no more extraction can be done. We look at that in terms of, in dynamic terms, in these slides. So now we have three charts of a simulation of the semi-exact model structure. On the x-axis of the three red charts, we find the time measuring here. As you can see, the resources get depleted and just decreases. And the impact of available resource on extraction non-linearly goes towards zero, starting from 1, which was exactly the point. Now, desired extraction is a constant at 100 resources per year, and multiplied by the impact of available resources on extraction, it will go towards zero over time. What's the entire concept of this relationship is that this will maintain the stock of resources positive over time, in the sense that being a real physical variable that will never be able to go negative over time. And this is extremely important. Now, if you expand this kind of thinking towards an impact of resource depletion towards the economy, we can start expanding that with a little capital sector that, again, is in the same way as the limits we wrote, is represented having a capital discard, which is, of course, a fraction of capital. Is like taking like a certain time to have obsolescence of capital. It will require a constant flow away of capital. And then in this model, very simply, I pick that same desired the capital discard and increase by a fraction, let's say 2-3%, define the desired investment. So what I'm trying to do in this case is generate an investment, a capital investment, which is exactly as much as a fraction increase to the capital discard, which basically will determine some sort of exponential growth. Now, we link this new piece of structure to what we had before, just making the desired extraction an endogenous variable. So it used to be exogenous in the previous chart, and now it's going to become endogenous. And let's say it is a constant increase depending on the amount of capital. Now, the same exact structure will generate a resource extraction going towards zero over time. This generates, we calculate an extraction ratio between desired extraction and resource extraction. And the extraction ratio, again, will have an impact from 1 going towards 0, the more the resources get extracted. As a result, the more we extract resources, the more that influence on output will go towards 0 till the point in which the actual output of the economy will not be never sufficient to even create the sufficient investment to pay for the capital discard. And the result of it will be, as we saw in the limits growth model, growth for a certain time and then collapse when resources deplete. Now, an important element of system dynamics that is often neglected by a lot of people is that this focused on two main streams. On the one hand, we had the ecological modeling aspect. That's why it's famous for, including limits of growth and so on. On the other hand, the methodology focused a lot on the micro-level management practices, including decision-making, including human behavior, including the sort of cognitive capabilities of people when they feedback their decision into the system. So one of the fundamentals of decision-making system dynamics follows these 5 simple rules. First of all, it requires what is called the Baker criterion, which basically requires that all the input to the decision rules, decision variable, must be restricted to the information actually available to the real decision maker. So it has a lot of influence about realism into the system modeling. Then they want to look at managerial practice. So they want to really model the way people behave into systems. They want to differentiate between desired and actual condition. That's so important to make sure model remain consistent. They expect realistic behavior under extreme conditions. And they do not expect to have an equilibrium into the system. As a result, if the model can find an equilibrium, that should emerge from the interaction, not being computed a priori, as normally do in general equilibrium theory and economic theory in general. As a result, we show the following. In this particular case, we want to show how the decision-making can be applied, for example, in the case of financial decision into a system dynamics model. So imagine you are a financial manager into your company. You have cash coming into your cash inflows, basically cash coming into your vault of cash, and this can be revenue, can be borrowing, and anything. And then you have to control the cash outflows depending on how your cash is actually, how much cash you have got. As a result, you can store it as liquidity using return earnings, so take out liquidity based on return losses, and try to control your stock of liquidity to the desired levels. Now, in general, the desires for a certain liquidity can be thought as a constant rate in comparison to how much payments one want to make. So, for example, if I need to have £100,000 of expenditure every year, maybe I will try for safety reason to keep £50,000 in the vault all the time, so to manage risk over the dynamic of the system. So at this point, you can imagine that the desired payments that need to be done come as a sum of all the individual desired payments, maybe coming from all different areas of the company. One can be taxes, one can be interest rates, one can be payment for energy bills and capital, and hiring people. And the result of it is simply that the liquidity that we have, the actual condition, will be compared to the desired actual condition and generates a liquidity adequacy. That, as we saw in the previous case, in the case of resources, that's nothing more than a ratio, a fraction between the liquidity and the desired liquidity. That's what we call an anchor and adjustment heuristic. The model will anchor to the desired liquidity and generate an adjustment to control liquidity towards the desired liquidity. So what happens is that liquidity adequacy will become an input to all the nonlinear relationships that we find on the right, which will act as a multiplier for each individual payment, generating on the bottom side a sum of permissible outflows and payments, which will generate automatically the cash flows, controlling the amount of cash that can never go negative. So as you can see, all the nonlinear relationships on the right tend to be beyond or above 1 when we have a surplus of liquidity, which basically means that they will allow for the desired payments to be made, and they go towards 0 the lower the liquidity is. of course, if there's no liquidity in the bank or there's no liquidity in the firm, they cannot pay anything. As a result, they will need to constrain the actual payments, and as a result, they will feed back to the real economy somehow. So if you understood this, you should now be able to read without any problem the book that we wrote with Professor Aled Jones. The book is named Resources, Financial Risk in the Dynamics of Growth, System and Global Society. It's focused on global emerging risk, and we're going to talk about that in the next lecture. It includes much more than what we said in this presentation. It includes system dynamics, but also detailed description of the limits of growth, review of economic theory and method, and provides a description of the state of the ecological system today, and describes in detail the ecological risk and resources, environments, and environment area model. It is the model I built with my research. Most important, if you are interested, you can download the area model for free alongside all simulation runs and appendixes with equation and tests at the following link that you can actually get by looking for myself on the Anglia Ruskin University website. So to give a summary, this lecture reviewed the approach of system thinking to complex systems and system dynamics. We gave a little overview of the history of system dynamics. It provided the fundamentals that are necessary to give an interpretation to the structure of system dynamics models. It has shown the use of the nonlinear relationship for system dynamics model, in particular for modeling risks. This, in fact, form all the basic necessary to understand the next lecture, and the book Resources, Financial Risk in the Dynamics of Growth that provides an important source for modeling risk using system dynamics methods. With the references, I hope this lecture was interesting for you, and thank you for listening.